welcome to a special edition of Political Empire. I'm Jeff Horseman with the Press Enterprise and PE.com, and we're coming to you live today from the Press Enterprise studios, talking about an issue that has generated a lot of comments on social media, and it always seems to bring out emotion from both sides. And we're talking about pit bulls, and specifically laws that require them to be spayed or neutered. This is something that we first came up earlier this year in Riverside County, and it took a number of months to craft that ordinance, and then the county ultimately passed a law requiring pit bull sterilization in the unincorporated or the non-city parts of the county. And now, since then, the city of Riverside has enacted its own sterilization ordinance, and Riverside County officials have made it clear that they would like to see other cities within the county enact similar legislation. And so what we have for you today are two gentlemen who represent both perspectives on this. Here in the dark suit is Riverside City Councilman Mike Gardner of Ward 1, who is a proponent of his city's sterilization law, and opposite him is Josh Liddy, who is a dog advocate with SwayLove.org. That is they advocate for pit bulls and for shelter reform. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining me today. I appreciate it. And again, like I said, this isn't a formal debate, but we just want to give people a chance to hear from both of you and hear both sides of this and make up their mind. And by the way, we're going to have if you want to submit a question, you can send it to webteam@pe.com or on Twitter using the hashtag PEPitbulls. I'll be searching for that, and hopefully we can get a couple of your questions in. But I'm going to start out with you, Mr. Gardner. I just want to ask you, just generally, why you thought it was important for your city to have this law on the books.
Okay, and if I can, I'd like to sort of add a little description of what the ordinance is and isn't, because
Absolutely.
Some people don't understand it as it truly exists.
Okay.
I think it's important for two reasons. One is, rightly or wrongly, there is a very strong public perception that pit bulls can be a dangerous animal, and in our city, just in the ward that I represent, in the last 2 years, I've had 4 instances where dogs that were identified as pit bulls either attacked people or other pets, and there's pretty serious consequences. I had an older constituent whose face was badly disfigured. She almost lost an eye. And so there's a bit of that aspect of it to try to reduce the number of animals that are out roaming, particularly male dogs that are unaltered, have a very strong urge to go after any female that's in heat, and they're not breed specific. Any dog will do. So it does cut down roaming, which cuts down the unplanned encounters between dogs and people. But maybe more importantly to me, in Riverside County, 20% of the animals that are in our shelter are identified as pit bulls and pit bull mixes, and 30%, so an inordinate number of the animals that are put down, nice way of saying they kill them, are pit bulls and pit bull mixes. Our biggest adoption agency in the area, the Mary S. Roberts Pet Adoption Center, a long-standing, good organization, will only take 1 pit and 1 pit mix at a time because they find them hard to place. And Josh, I think, will tell you why that's a problem. Part of it is public perception, and it's driven by a lot of things, and some of it is inaccurate, but it is a real perception. So they are hard to place. That's part of why we put so many down. So I would really like to not make so many pit bulls and pit mixes, simply because there are way more of them than there is demand for them, and we end up having to kill them.
All right. Now, Mr. Liddy, I know you're very passionate about this issue, and you've spoken before the county supervisors and I believe other forums, talking about why you think these ordinances are a bad idea. What are some of the main arguments you see against this type of legislation?
Well, first of all, it's called breed-specific legislation, but if you actually read the laws, there's nothing specific about it at all, really. So that's kind of a funny thing at the beginning. And then when we're referencing a tax, which are a very small amount of dogs when compared to the actual dog population. There's circumstances that go along with those attacks that are consistent almost every time. It's either, Mr. Gardner mentioned roaming dogs. Well, we have leash laws. If a dog is out roaming and it does something, it gets deemed dangerous. The city and the county both have dangerous dog law, a dangerous dog law for that, appropriate for that. If it's not tough enough, they can always go in and strengthen it in any number of ways. So when we're talking fatalities with dogs, it's either a roaming stray dog that's loose, unsupervised by the owner's nowhere to be seen. It attacks as an individual or in a pack, a lot of times in packs, or it's an unsupervised child that ends up in a backyard per se with a dog that's not a family dog. It's in the yard, it's chained or fenced, tethered. The child wanders out unsupervised and ends up in this environment with the dog. Normally in that circumstance, if the dog wasn't chained or tethered, the dog would just flee. But when a dog is chained, it has no other option but to basically do what it does if it's uncomfortable and something enters that environment. And when we're talking dogs in that environment, first of all, those aren't family pets. They're probably not very well socialized, so that's a whole other argument and issue. But when we're talking pit bulls specifically, what's the identification process? Mr. Gardner referenced 4 attacks. I don't know the specifics on those attacks, but they probably fit those 2 components, one or the other. But who identified them as pit bulls? Who has the ability to do that? Because there's tons of evidence that shows that that isn't the case, and it's not basically possible scientifically to even do. Pit bulls, in the generic term, is just that, a generic term. It's not a breed. There's an American Pit Bull Terrier, Staffordshire Terrier. But the way most people talk about pit bulls is just a generic term that is referencing a mixed breed dog. And anytime something happens with that dog, it's always the pit portion of that gets the headlines. Even though it's a mixed dog, nothing else makes those headlines.
Okay. Now, you talked about, kind of maybe confusion about, what is a pit bull, what goes into that. What are some of the other common misconceptions you think are about these type of dogs that people need to understand and need to correct?
Well, just that, basically, that they're dogs, first and foremost, because there's a lot of tonality that people put out that basically state they're separate from the dog population, which is completely untrue. They're dogs. So that's first and foremost the biggest thing. The other thing is, when we are referencing attacks, we are referencing 10 attacks, 20 a year. There's millions of pit bulls in the country. There's tens of thousands in this city, in the county. Robert Miller, who runs the shelter, stated as much. And these are just numbers that come from the registered dogs, which is a low fraction of the total dogs that you have in these areas. So just on that specific area alone, we're looking at, thousands and thousands of dogs, countrywide, millions of actual pit bulls have never done anything. And they all blanketly take the blame. It's all implied that they're all inherently vicious, engineered differently, aggressive. I attended the county meeting. I was there. I witnessed these 5 board of supervisors talking about these dogs for a couple hours. And tons of times they reference these dogs as vicious, aggressive, inherently dangerous, engineered differently, X, Y, and Z. The implication is that they're different. And then they want to come back and, well, it's not about that. Because they know state law permits that. And honestly, I would like to ask Mr. Gardner, if state law didn't permit that, would this be an attempt at a ban?
Mr. Gardner, you care to respond to that?
Well, there's nothing in the city's ordinance that prevents people from having pit bulls. And I agree with Josh. There are some wonderful pit bulls out there. I've met some really nice pit bulls. I've met some that weren't so nice too. But that honestly is true of almost any breed. Riverside's ordinance is it has, I think, a reasonable level of specificity. It does identify Staffordshire Terriers, American Pit Bull Terriers, and Pit Bull mixes. It's not identified in the ordinance, but is being established now if there's a challenge to what is a particular dog. There's a panel that will be put together that will make that determination, and that panel will include a shelter employee who is a St. Bernard breeder and a dog behaviorist, a shelter employee from the county's Coachella shelter, and if they can find one who is willing to serve, they would like to get what's called a bully breeder to sit. And we really are looking to try to get a fair determination. And honestly, I don't think you're going to see an issue in most cases unless it's a dog like Josh was talking about that is not well trained and is not well supervised, socialized. Yes, the law does apply to them, but most people that I know who are good, responsible owners spay or neuter their animals anyway, regardless of their breed, because frankly, they make better pets, and they don't reproduce unintentionally. The city's ordinance does allow a registered breeder to continue to have intact dogs and to breed and sell dogs. There's nothing in the city's ordinance that says that you can't keep a pit bull. It just requires that pits and pit mixes be spayed or neutered before they reach sexual maturity, and that's kind of important. If you spay, particularly male, after sexual maturity, it has less of a calming effect on them in general. I think another important point is on identifying a type of dog is most animals that are licensed are never seen by the Department of Animal Services or the city, for that matter. They are identified on the papers, the licensing papers, either by the vet who administers the rabies inoculation that is required, or by the owner as a particular breed of dog. So if on your papers you say my dog's pit bull, then as far as the county's concerned, that dog's pit bull. If you say it's a Cocker Spaniel, they think it's a Cocker Spaniel unless something comes up where there's a problem and somebody looks at it and says, I don't think that one's a Cocker Spaniel, I think that's pit bull. And if there's a disagreement, then it can go to this board and a determination gets made.
But I wanted to ask you, because I've heard this point made repeatedly, which is, this is all well and good if you want to do this type of ordinance, but the fact of the matter is if you have someone who wants their pit bull to be mean, wants to be aggressive, is basically not a responsible pet owner, probably isn't following the law anyway, what's the point of having a law that, maybe is going to crack down on people trying to do the right thing while the people who are going to continue to ignore it? I want to give you a chance to respond to that.
I think that we want to actively enforce this law. And there are a number of ways of doing that. One is complaints from neighbors, and we do get a lot of those. Another is, as you know, Jeff, you may not, Josh, Riverside has its own utilities. So we have city employees who are meter readers, and there's nobody who knows where dogs that they're afraid of are more than a meter reader. Even more than letter carriers, because they're mostly motor routes now. So I expect that we will get reports and complaints that will cause someone to go to a house and say, what is this dog, and is it altered or not? We also pay the county, Department of Animal Services, to canvass neighborhoods every year looking for animals that are not licensed. And if you come across one that is not licensed and appears to be an intact pit bull, that will become another part of the follow-up.
Okay. Now, Mr. Lee, first of all, is there anything that Mr. Gardner has said thus far that you want to have a chance to address?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Go ahead.
Well, with all due respect, the claim that this new ordinance is going to be enforced, the track record doesn't exist for enforcement. Like I already stated once, there's already a dangerous dog law in both county and city. And city actually has a mandatory spay and neuter law for all pets. It's a secondary law. They have the ability to change that if they want to. But the law's already there for all dogs, and they're doing this on top of that. What's the need to make it breed specific if pit bulls are dogs too, so they fall into that first law, which is not being enforced, just like the dangerous dog law isn't being enforced, just like the leash law isn't being enforced when a roaming dog attacks, maims, kills somebody, regardless of the breed. Another point he made was how it's spelled out in the ordinance, the breeds of dog. Well, yeah, in text it's spelled out, but visually, how are you going to identify these dogs? You can create a panel and put 2, 3, 4 people on it, but there's studies out there that show that shelter workers can't even identify their own impounded dogs. There's a Victoria Voice study, people can look it up online, and one of the shelters they actually used was the Riverside County shelter. 73% of the time, this is overall a number, 73% of the time, impounded dogs went misidentified when compared to actual DNA evidence. So put whoever you want on that panel. There's still not a lot of, it's still a very iffy thing when we're talking about pit bulls specifically, because it's a term basically.
But one point I want you to address a little further is, one of the things Mr. Gardner raised in the beginning was the idea that we need laws like this because the shelters, just a preponderance of these types of dogs, they're very hard to adopt out. People think, rightly or wrongly, they have this reputation for viciousness. And all that ends up is they end up getting euthanized and put, it's a horrible situation for everyone involved. And isn't it incumbent upon us to make sure we get as many of these dogs spayed or neutered as possible to prevent this type of situation from happening? So I want to give you a chance to address that.
Spay and neutering is good. My own dogs, I have 3 pit bull mixes. They're all spayed and neutered. So I'm not against spay and neutering at all. I find the actual mandated laws to be problematic because they target specific facets of the community. Lower income people and low income, spay and neuter clinics aren't readily available. And basically all this does when these laws go into effect is make your shelter intakes go up, which in turn makes killing go up. But as far as, pointing out shelter killing, I know all about that because that's how I start. Well, I started with Sway, but once Sway passed away, I started going to shelters and taking photographs. And once inside, I learned how the shelter system worked. I saw it with my own eyes. So I know all about that, and this speaks specifically to Riverside County. One of the things that gets me most worked up and angry is that the disingenuous coming from Robert Miller, who runs the shelter, because I know that they not only have 1, but they have 3 buildings at their county facility, 3 buildings that are off limits to the public. Public cannot go.
Okay.
They store, majority of dogs that they store in those buildings are pit bulls. They're not stored for a day or 2 and then moved to the adoption floor. They're stored there indefinitely and then moved to the kill room and killed. And then he wants to claim that adoption numbers are low. Well, no one can see the dogs. And why do you think adoption numbers are low just in a general sense? Because this kind of stuff is going on. These stereotypes are perpetuated by this type of stuff. And it's not fair, because like I said, there's millions of these dogs who are innocent, mine included.
Okay. I did want to get to, it's more of a statement, less of a question about, we got something in via email from a Lillian Barber. I don't really have a question, but I do have a comment about this type of legislation. Whenever a law of this type is implemented, it seriously affects only the conscientious owners and breeders. The type of dog who allows their pit bull or whatever breed of dog they own to roam the streets or other public places out of control and to endanger humans and their pets totally ignores the law without consequences, while responsible owners are deprived of their right to keep their animals and use them for breeding, showing, other dog-related hobby activities. Now, Mr. Gardner, we kind of talked about this earlier, but is there anything you want to say to assure people like Lillian or to respond to what she's saying?
Well, again, if you are a registered breeder, you can have an intact pit or pit mix. So that's, I don't think that's an issue. I would like to get rid of backyard breeding of all dogs, not just pits. Too often it's just not well controlled. They create a lot of problem dogs that way, and there are some very good ones, but they tend to not socialize the puppies well. It's just not a good situation. So professional breeders can still happen. They can be in the city, they can be in the county. I think the issue is for dogs that are loose. Yeah, yes, people break the law. It's illegal to rob banks, but people still rob banks. So we try, and we will continue to try, to identify specifically pits and pit mixes that are not altered and get them altered. We don't want to wipe out the breed. We don't want to prevent people from having them, but we do want to get them spayed and neutered.
Okay. Now, Mr. Liddy, again, one of the things I've heard from people who are advocates for this breed is that, education and outreach is key. Getting people, getting the dog socialized. If you have this type of dog, learning how to train it properly and to, dispel that, that reputation that it has. But given that, particularly with local governments, still, particularly here in the Inland Empire, still recovering from the recession, we don't have maybe the money that we used to. I know Animal Control has had its budget cut significantly since the Great Recession hit. I mean, how do you advance that goal? How much education, I guess, and how much outreach you can do when, perhaps there are limited resources, or maybe you don't see them limited at all, but I want to give you a chance to talk about that, advance that education aspect.
Well, yeah, I think there's plenty of resources. They just need to be shifted.
Okay.
I think resources are being used on certain things and wasted on certain things, where if there was a different perspective running the shelter, for example, because that's where change starts, is the top. You need a compassionate director, and I don't believe Mr. Miller is that. There's a lot of different things that can be done instead of just stashing dogs and killing them. You can reach out to the communities. You don't have to villainize these dogs in the press. You don't have to put out these laws and double down and triple down on laws that already exist. Most people don't know that these laws exist. I'm here trying to inform people of this, but common sense says the law's already there. It's not enforced. How are you going to enforce the second law? But so often the public is not engaged and not brought into the process. Like I stated earlier, a lot of these laws affect low-income communities. Some people argue that that's part of the point, to target these communities. I'm not going to claim that, but bottom line is these people don't have the ability to even sometimes afford $100 spay and neuter operation, or $125. When you have vouchers that are $35, it's still like $80 out. I mean, we're probably all a lot better off, but there's a lot of people who aren't. And that is an issue when you have government coming around and basically taking people's private property, which is what dogs are. They're property in the eyes of the law. And one of the most troubling aspects, and this is why I'm holding this paper, is because the law here, Section 6 of this law, both county and city, the identification process is massively flawed, but they actually put into text that they will determine what the breed of dog is. That becomes the evidence, that becomes the facts, and then it's the public's, the burden of proof shifts to the actual person that got their dog taken, which is this is America. That's unconstitutional, and this law will probably be struck down because of that verbiage, and I can't wait until it is.
Okay. Mr. Gardner, care to respond to any what Mr. Liddy had to say there?
I would disagree with the last point on the identification and the taking. I think it's intended to be a participative process, just as Josh identifies dogs as pit bulls, others do too, and there's no question, it is subjective, because they are a mixed group of animals that have come to be classed as pit bull. DNA evidence is more difficult to get. I mean, if you're talking about a Staffordshire Terrier, that's much more straightforward. But something that's a Staffordshire something else mix that you or I might call a pit is going to show up as a mix on DNA. So DNA is maybe not the best way to look at it, and it is expensive. the other issue on cost of spay and neuter, partly because there are so many pits in our area. Mary S. Roberts has received a grant from the American Humane Society for very low cost. I believe it's $25 spay and neuter for pits and chihuahuas in 2 local zip codes, 92501, which includes downtown Riverside, and I believe it's 92509, which is Harupa Valley area. And so, I mean, that's a plus. And then our shelter does have, it's overloaded, but it does have a low-cost spay and neuter clinic there as well. And that's a burden on government. If we're going to require people to spay and neuter animals, we need to make it possible for them to do that.
Okay. I just want to point something out real quick that he said in regards to me identifying dogs as pit bulls. I do as well. Everybody does visually, because that's really all, that most people initially use. But I don't do it to put a negative connotation on a dog, though. I'm not. That's the difference. I'm not looking at a dog and saying it is this and therefore it's bad. And that's what the pro BSL side of this does consistently, constantly. And these dogs are vilified over and over and over again. So,
one question I wanted to ask both of you, I mean, it's a common thread I see in the comments we get, whenever we write about this topic is, well, why not just pit bulls? Why don't we have an ordinance on the books for, every dog?
There is.
Or every, Well, I mean, I'll let you jump in on that. I mean, yeah, it's this whole idea that we ought to just not do this for pit bulls, we ought to do this for every dog.
Right.
Well,
I was sorry to interrupt, but
okay.
There already is a mandatory spay and neuter with city for every dog. So I would like the answer to that question as well. That is the initial rational question that everyone should have if they know about it, and I want the answer to that as well.
Okay,
so.
Mr. Gardner,
be happy to provide it. As Josh pointed out, that is a secondary enforcement law. If an animal comes into the possession, or if Department of Animal Services comes across an animal, it's picked up as a stray, or it bites somebody, or damages somebody else's pet, and they call and take possession of the animal. Then, to get the animal back, you need to get it spayed or neutered.
That's a good thing, though.
I agree. I think it's a combination of things that the more active enforcement and the flat requirement that all dogs be spayed or neutered is twofold. One is it's just such a large population that it's very difficult to accomplish it. And the other, in all honesty, is a matter of political will. There is, just as there is a level of public objection to requiring that pit bulls be spayed and neutered, there's an even greater outcry if you do all dogs in general. And I don't think most governmental bodies have the political wherewithal to withstand that pressure. Because of the way pits are characterized and many people perceive them, the political possibility of accomplishing it at that level does exist. I don't think you could do that for Cocker Spaniels.
So you're going to take advantage of it because most people, you're admitting that most people are uneducated about pit bulls, so you're going to then just throw them under the bus? I mean, I also pointed out that the law is a secondary enforcement, but it doesn't have to be. They can change that. They have the power to change that if they wanted to. They can go in, restructure the law, and how it stands right now, it says, well, if there's a roaming dog, it comes in, it can't go back out until it's spayed and neutered. That is a good thing. That's definitely a good thing. All shelter animals are not supposed to leave the shelter unless they're spayed and neutered. That is how it should work. Mr. Gardner sits on the council. He has the ability to suggest changes to the laws. The council has the ability to change these laws. So I feel like that question was flat out dodged because, yes, it is a secondary enforcement, but they can change it. They have the power to change it whenever they want to.
Okay. Mr. Gardner?
Josh is right. The council could change it. I don't believe that there are votes to do that. And, fair or not, the public perception does helped drive the political will that allowed this for pit bulls. I would like to see mandatory spay and neuter for all dogs and all cats. Honestly, I would like to see cats licensed. They're not. But it's too big a step. Government hasn't got the guts to do it.
Well, regardless, I mean, if you can acknowledge something as unfair or possibly unfair, I don't know your personal, specifics of your personal stance on this, but if you can acknowledge something as being possibly unfair, we're talking about willpower here. Why don't, regardless of whether there's the votes or not, why don't you stand up and say it's unfair, unjust? That's what I'm doing. This is an unjust law, straight out. So,
all right. I guess the only one other question I had prepared for this was, like I said at the beginning, this is an issue that, people on both sides feel very strongly. I mean, you saw at the hearings, you got people on the one hand talking about relatives of theirs, perhaps who they blame pit bulls for attack, and they're looking at it as, I think one woman said this is a life or death issue. On the other hand, you have people who love these dogs sincerely and believe that that these laws are unfair and feel very strongly that they're discriminatory. In the middle of this, where both sides can kind of get together and come up with a solution, or I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is there room for compromise in any part of this?
I feel like that's all I've put forth is other ideas. You referenced the person at the Board of Supervisors spoke. There was a couple people that spoke of attacks. The very last commenter was a lady who had her granddaughter mauled by a baby pit bull. That was her words. It was like a decade ago or something. And the next sentence out of her mouth was, the babysitter left my niece for 3 hours and went to the grocery store. That goes in one ear and out the other of a lot of people. So if that is actually the focus, there's your compromise. I mean, like, so few attacks happen, and there's common denominators in almost every one, and yet this pro-BSL lobby, anti-pit bull lobby, and I'm not saying Mike's, part of that, but in general, the people that exist out there that push these laws, they pay no attention to those common sense things that are there in almost every attack, fatality. They're there, and it just gets ignored.
I think that a driving factor here is when you hear about a dog attack, whether it's on people or other pets, the predominant dog that it's attributed to is a pit bull. I don't think that's probably always right, but you almost never hear of other breeds being involved in an attack on a person with serious injury. And it does happen. And I think over time, if we can get a handle on the pit bull population and we can reduce the numbers to where the dogs that are there are in families that really want them and will take care of them, I think that will really help. There were times when other breeds were overbred and inbred, and they developed bad reputations, and that's kind of gotten away as the breeding has improved. Rottweilers, German Shepherds for a while, Chows, St. Bernards even, were overbred, inbred, and suddenly a family pet would turn around and bite somebody. Any large dog that bites can do serious damage to somebody. I've never heard of anybody being mauled to death by Chihuahuas, even a pack of them. Bitten, yes, but I think if we can get a handle on the number of pits out there, and if we can get breeding to improve, and we stop having so many that really aren't wanted and aren't cared for, I think it will begin to swing as it has for some of the other breeds.
Okay. Well, yeah, I was actually going to get into, we're going about half an hour here. We're probably going to wind down. But I want to give each of you, starting with you, Mr. Liddy, a chance to respond and just address anything that maybe you feel need to be covered further. I didn't ask or anything, so I'll give you the floor.
Okay. Well, yeah, I just wanted to respond to that. The ASPCA says, they went on record saying that animal control officers tell them they call the media when other dogs report. The media doesn't want anything to do with it. They're not going to report stories unless it involves a pit bull. Another component of that is media coverage, news coverage. Quotes in a newspaper is what these numbers are based in. They're not based in any evidence. The people tallying fatalities and attributing them to pit bulls the evidence is, well, the newspaper said it. Most of these attacks, fatalities, there's never any even picture or image of the dog. So these numbers are so small, it's cherry-picked information, and the evidence just patently doesn't exist, and yet it's just attributed to a pit bull, and that goes out, and that's the talking point, and it gets multiplied and multiplied and multiplied. And there have been numerous and many fatalities that didn't involve pit bulls. Not a Chihuahua per se, but there's a heck of a lot of breeds out there, and a lot of breeds have killed people. And that's not to say that any breed should be judged or discriminated against because of that. That's one dog. It's an individual dog, and that's where we need to focus on. Individual dogs' behavior, individual person's behavior. More importantly than that, because that's where the dog is getting the bad behavior from. He mentioned a little while ago, people rob banks or something like that. That's not going to stop. You're right. But what if I went in and robbed a bank? I'm a white guy. You're going to pass a law against all white guys then? That's what this is.
All right. Mr. Gardner, anything else you want to say on this topic?
Yeah, I think we've pretty well covered it. The important points that I hope people remember is Riverside's ordinance doesn't attempt to ban any breed of dog. It doesn't prevent people from having them. It doesn't prevent people from breeding them. Josh is right. The number of dogs that bite people or other animals is a small percentage of the overall population, and there are not good, from a scientific perspective, statistics on dog bites or fatalities at all. Because we just, as a society, we don't keep those records in that kind of a manner. The animal control officer that goes to the scene, or a police officer that goes to the scene, says that dog's a so-and-so. That's what goes in the report. I think the media in general may play up a pit bull attack over, say, a German Shepherd attack. Is it fair? No. But I think it's reality. And having that sense of concern in the public lets government get to the point of mandating, at least for pits, the mandatory spay-neuter. Maybe we can grow this ultimately to mandatory for everybody, which is where I'd like to see us.
All right. Well, if that's it, well, gentlemen, I want to first of all thank both of you for taking the time to come in and share your point of view on this. Appreciate it. And I want to thank you for watching. I hope this has been an interesting and informative discussion for you. We will continue to cover this subject as it warrants. Right now I'm not aware of any other cities that have enacted at least a proposal on the agenda, but like I said, Riverside County has talked about wanting more cities to adopt this type of legislation, and so who knows, you might be seeing your city or a city near you discussing this. So for the Press Enterprise MP.com, I'm Jeff Horseman. Thank you for watching.